7:45 on CBC Radio 1. More details continue to emerge about a shooting that left two men dead at an East End McDonald's this past weekend. CBC News has learned that the shooter was working for a private security firm contracted by the TTC. His lawyer maintains that the gun that was in his possession was lawfully possessed, but this story has left a lot of people wondering who exactly is carrying a gun to work and how well trained they are in the weapon's use. Gary Kleiman is the CEO of Valguard Security, which is an armed services company. He is with me in studio. Good morning.
Good morning.
Your company wasn't involved in Saturday's shooting, but it certainly is your field. What was your reaction when you heard that a security guard was involved in a shooting like this in a fast food restaurant after a scuffle broke out?
Well, naturally, I was concerned. After all, it was a fatal incident. I have to admit it, I didn't really understand what he was doing there, because sometimes there are armed couriers who are servicing such places. So I was wondering back at the time when I first heard of it, whether he was there on duty or just for a break. And apparently he was there for his lunch break.
As I mentioned, CBC has learned that this shooter was working for this private security firm that was contracted by the TTC. What kind of security guard is carrying a gun on the job?
Well, carrying a firearm is not very common. Not too many guards carry sidearms while on duty. It is usually has to do a lot with the object protected. So you would expect when there's high values and valuable liabilities, a sidearm will be carried while on duty, mainly jewelry stores, currency businesses, and so on.
It's pretty specific, though, what fields you are involved in and what you are keeping an eye on whether you're allowed to carry a firearm.
Oh, absolutely, yes. It does make sense. You would not carry a firearm to protect something that's not that valuable, let's say a grocery store or something of the sort. But definitely if you have a high-value jewelry store, for instance, you would expect security to be armed while on site.
Who makes that designation?
The client, basically.
So the client can say, I think that what we have is valuable enough that we would like to have armed security.
The client can make a request. The CFO, which is the Chief Firearms Office under the jurisdiction of the RCMP, has to approve every location and every single guard stationed at that location if firearms are involved.
What are the rules? And I ask this because we live in a society where firearms are severely restricted. What are the rules in terms of carrying those weapons around outside of the purview of your job?
Well, you cannot carry them outside the purview of your job. Period. You have to, you receive the firearm, which belongs to the company, when you step in to duty, and there's usually a supervisor or somebody who will make sure that you're fit for duty for that day, not too tired and so on, and you have to disarm at the end of your shift. The firearm belongs to the company, doesn't belong to the guard, and it usually stays at the site, with the exception of armed couriers who are more mobile with their firearms.
What about in the middle of the shift? Police say that this man was picking up food at the McDonald's. He was working nearby.
Yes, it is, how should I put it, uncommon, but definitely not unheard of.
If this was one of your employees, would you advise that he stop at McDonald's at 3 o'clock in the morning to get a bite still with a firearm strapped around his waist?
I have to admit that I will advise strongly against it. The general instructions are to reduce friction with the general public to the bare minimal. So let's first of all, we have to distinguish armed security, which is stationary, versus armed couriers, which are mobile by nature.
So what do you mean by reduced friction?
Well, meaning, how should I put it? It depends if we're talking about stationary armed security or armed couriers. If we're talking about stationary armed security, I would expect the armed security to remain at the post and to try not to leave the post if it's not absolutely necessary. Usually the restrooms are at the post, and preferably I would expect the guard to bring his lunch with him and have it at his post or close to it, kitchen or someplace like that. I cannot say for sure that I would forbid walking outside the site, but strongly advise against it, and might request the guard to ask for permission from headquarters every time that he does that.
What would your concerns be about that? I mean, again,
exactly what happened on this weekend.
The lawyer for the individual has said, again, that the gun was lawfully possessed.
It was. And according to regulations, and this is something that has to be strictly observed, A guard is only allowed to use his sidearm, his firearm, as last resort when there's immediate and clear threat to his life or the life of somebody under his protection, such as a colleague or a client. I can only assume, I don't know the particulars of this case specifically, but I can only assume that the guard has felt that his life are being threatened. Otherwise, I do not expect him to use a firearm, and I wouldn't expect that to happen.
Just finally, how do you expect a story like this to affect your business? I mean, there are a lot of questions we don't know the answers to yet, but the reason that you're here is because of those questions.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I'll tell you one thing. Every time something like that happens, not only that it's being taken into account, but it's becoming part of the curriculum and the training. Okay, so every incident that involves firearms, automatically, at least with our company, becomes part of the training program. So I would say for years to come, you would expect in our courses to have the instructors talk about this case and as an actual case that happened, what could have happened differently, what should have happened differently, what's the best way to avoid something like that from ever happening again.
It's been really good to have you here. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Gary Kleiman is the CEO of Valguard Security, an armed security company. We were talking about the incident in a McDonald's in the East End of Toronto this past weekend, in which 2 men were left dead. The shooter was working for a private security firm contracted by the TTC, and his lawyer says that the gun that he had was lawfully possessed. 9 minutes before 8 a.m. To Mary Ween.